Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm sitting outside the Wallace collection with Augusto Boer Bront. Yeah? How was my pronunciation? Not too bad. And Augusto, some of you will certainly know who he is from the 14th century Armour Facebook page. Okay, and his other works, his other great works, and some of you won't know him, so now you know him, and definitely there's going to be a link straight underneath this video, so go and click on, pause this video and go and click on that link and open up the page and you can see what he does. And so let's talk about that page first, and then we'll rewind to how you got into it. So tell us, what is that page for, you know, what's the purpose of it?
So actually, we started the page, me and a friend, Marco Fiaccadori, which is part of the Italian team for the Battle of the Nations. And there was a lot of frustration from his side and also my side for the lack of, as in the whole actual Boer community, sorry, but it's kind of true, like the lack of like historical depth in the armor, especially in equipment. So he wanted to create this group where we would combine all together all the sources we have for armor, so like both original images of original extant museums and manuscript, miniatures, effigies and everything. So you could put everything in one place so people could go and see if this is historically accurate or not.
So just to explain for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, but Battle of the Nations is, if you've ever seen those videos on YouTube or elsewhere of the full contact steel fighting stuff that happens mostly in Eastern Europe, in Russia and Ukraine and Poland, but it has now got big kind of all over Europe, and in fact a lot of reenactors have got into it, and it is mostly centered on 14th century armor.
Yes, exactly.
But the point is that the majority, some would say all, but let's say the majority of the armor that is 14th century style or inspired by 14th century armor in Battle of the Nations groups and tournaments and stuff, most of it's not very accurate at all. And so one of the first things, so I'm quite into armour, but I'm not like Ian Lespina level, and I'm not Augusto level, but I love, so shout out to Ian Lespina, and I'll put a link to his video, to his YouTube channel below. I'm sure you all know him anyway, Knight Errant. But anyway, I am pretty much into armour, and I actually did my degree dissertation on the development of the coat of plates. Looking back on it now, I was working in isolation. I had Bengt Thordeman's 1939 book to go from, and just having looked at lots of manuscripts. But because I'm so ancient, the internet was not as great a resource in the year 2000 when I graduated as it is now, and simply there wasn't as much stuff to be able to find online as there is now. So I was mostly working from books in libraries, and I was working at the British Library. I was going through the Romance of Alexander, for example, from 1340-ish, 1338 to 44 I think it is, and that's a great resource for mid-14th century armour, and it shows coats of plates and all this kind of stuff, so it's, you know, but I was mostly working from hard copy publications, and these days it's so much easier to gather and find information. You know, on your website you keep finding things in museums and collections that the arms and armour community didn't know existed. It's like there's this perception that there isn't much 14th century armour around, and we'll probably talk about that in a minute, and there isn't compared to 15th century armour, but there's more of it than some people realise, isn't there? And there's pieces and fragments, and every now and again something new gets discovered, not just in a collection but archaeologically. When I was at university at UCL, I remember a 14th century helmet, and I never got to see it, so I don't know what type it was, but I know it was 14th century, came in for conservation at the university, and it had been found down a well. So they'd been excavating on a village site that had a well, and they'd got to the bottom of the well, and there was a helmet down at the bottom of it, and I don't think it had been converted into a pot or anything like that. It had just fallen. It had just fallen down the well, because I know some of them got converted into pots and buckets and stuff, but this had just literally, obviously someone had either thrown it or dropped it down the well by accident, you know, balanced it on the edge and then gone to get some water and gone, my helmet. But yeah, so going back to the Battle of the Nations armour and how you got into this, from my perspective, the obvious thing when you look at Battle of the Nations armour and then you look at a 14th century manuscript is the Battle of the Nations guys all look like Michelin or Michelin man. I use correct French pronunciation, Michelin man, or Michelin man as we say in Britain, and they look too bulky, and some people go, oh, that's because generally medieval people were a bit slimmer than some of the modern people doing it. That might be part of it, but also it's to do with the padding that's worn, the armour that's worn, and maybe you can talk a bit about like that.
I mean,
it's difficult to judge.
It comes down to money and time, and also like how one is willing, how much energy one is willing to spend. Because armor in those kind of competitions get mangled in 3 days, how it would be mangled in like maybe 3 months on a medieval battlefield, like general extrapolation. And so people need to like buy new armor, not every tournament, but almost. So you cannot. People usually don't want to spend €1,000 for a helmet that is going to be trashed away a year later.
And of course, there's an increasing use of titanium, for example, because
some tournaments are trying to ban it, but it's
because titanium is very hard to dent and it's very hard to work with. But once you've made it into a shape, it basically stays in that shape.
And it's lighter, but it's also more expensive. So it is tougher. But so I mean, the lack of silhouette, it's maybe not because people don't want it, but because there's no.
I wonder if there's an unspoken thing. So we usually say it's because the armour's not made as well fitted as it should be, or we say that they're wearing more padding than they should be, or we say that the people are just a bit bigger than they averagely would have been in the 14th century. But I think there's another element as well, and that's to do with our culture and our perception of what a hardcore fighter looks like. And to be completely honest, you look at a man dressed in civilian clothes in the 14th century, and what are they wearing? They're essentially wearing something that's not unlike a really tight evening dress, kind of sexy, kind of very waisted, wasp waisted, with a strange kind of puffed out chest, and wearing stockings, essentially hose, which are completely figure hugging. So their aesthetic of what looked good on a man is really different to ours, and I think that there is also. Whether it's conscious or subconscious, and I might be wrong on this, but I think there's modern people want to look like a space or like a space marine, like a Warhammer 40k space marine. They want to look big and manly, and the idea of manly in the 14th century was slightly different looking. Despite the fact, obviously, these guys, with their clothes off, would have looked ripped as hell, because people like Marshal Boucicaut, for example, were doing insane levels of physical exercise all the time just to stay in peak.
Don't get us wrong. I mean, people that do fight in this competition, especially like the tougher guys, like the Ukrainian or the Russians, they are incredibly fit athletes. I mean, they are. We're not. Sportsmen.
We're not. Yeah, I mean, I would never belittle what they do.
I mean, they're definitely like strong and fast and have a lot of endurance. But we're just talking about like the historical silhouettes of the armor that could be achieved also doing the sport. That's the main thing. Like, if people cared enough and, of course, had enough resources, there could be like a nicer tournament setting, which there still isn't.
Yeah. So let's move on from Battle of the Nations and talk about the actual 14th century armour. So first of all, now let's go back actually to how this started. So where did you start, how did you get, so Augusto doesn't only study the stuff, he's also now making armour and studying it as, qualification. How did you start? Where did it all begin?
I'm from Italy, and from a small town called Cividale del Friuli, which accidentally is the town that Fiore dei Libri was born in.
So Fiore is from, so you could be a descendant of Fiore for all you know.
I doubt it.
Yeah.
Let's just
one of his bastard children.
More probably. So there's a reenactment every year in my hometown, and it's something that has been going on for like 20 years or more. And it's like a medieval reenactment. It's one of these like festivals in costume where like you have like foods and drinks all around the town and everybody is dressed up. It's not very historically accurate, but it's very atmospheric.
It's what Americans would call a Ren Fair.
Yeah, it's a little bit more serious than a Ren Fair, but still like not really.
Generally speaking, European Ren Fairs tend to be a bit more historically accurate than American Ren Fairs. That's nothing anti-American. That's just a fact of it. So we tend not to mix periods so much.
Yeah, exactly.
We do have multi-period events, but like you only get Vikings mixing with Vikings or Anglo-Saxons, or 14th century mixing with 14th century. So it tends tend to be a bit more isolated than lots of periods all in one place.
Exactly. So then, when I was a kid, it was something that you would go to and just spend an afternoon with. But then when I was 14, 15, I started to take part in it, like dressed up as a spearman, like helmet, shield, and spear.
I did the same kind of thing.
Like
I was an
simple,
archer.
just with a tunic. And then over the years, I started to become more interested in like the armor, and the setting of this reenactment is 14th century, like second half of 14th century. So then I started to become more and more interested in the actual arms and armor. So I started to like buy the stuff, like cheap stuff from India, and then like a great helm was way too big for me, and then bought the chainmail, like almost everyone.
I've seen the photos on Facebook. Yeah.
Yes, so
of you looking very young.
Yes, exactly. So guilty as charged.
How many years ago was this? Because you're still quite young.
I mean, I'm 24 now,
Okay.
and I was 15
That's very
at the
young.
time. Yes. So then I started buying more and more, and then I realized at a certain point that the real stuff is so much more complicated in shapes, and it would cost so much money to buy it. So then I just decided when I was 18, fuck it, I want to do it.
Yeah.
I want to become.
And that's how most armourers start out, I think, because they want the armour, but they can't afford to buy it, so they learn how to make it.
So then when I was 18, I decided. I actually read, I think, an interview from Jiří Klepač, which is one of the greatest armourers around from Czech Republic, and then he said how he started, and then one evening I was reading it, and I said, I want to do the same. So then I just started, and then so right after high school, which I did study like Latin, Greek, philosophy, physics, art history, like very, very theoretical. I wanted to do really like something practical. So there's this education in Sweden, which is part of the Gothenburg University, where there's this metal art program where they have huge facilities for, the university education have like forges, mills, lathes, power hammers, like a lot of equipment. And then I said, this is the right place to be. But being an art education, you can't just do armor. I had my gripes with the teachers. I had a couple of conflicts at the end of the bachelor program, which I got my bachelor degree 3 years ago. Now I'm in the master education. So there's both a bachelor and a master.
So you finished your Bachelor of Arts, is it?
I think it's applied arts.
Yeah, and you're now doing a master's.
Level, yeah.
So is this 1 year you're doing?
It's my last year now.
Okay.
Yeah. So then over the years in this education in Sweden, I've been able to, among the other art projects that I've been doing, like public space projects, small sculptures and the like, I've been able to start developing. I'm still very, very at the very beginning. I'm able to make like helmets and maybe breastplates, but like making a whole suit, I don't have the time.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.